everybody. Once again, here is me, your favorite wolf dog, giving you another flip lecture, this time on the critical period, the period from 1783 to 1789, when we were making our new nation. So, constitution making started in the United States, in those states actually. The Continental Congress in 1776 was called upon to draft new constitutions. All of these new states had sovereignty, and that authority would rest with the people, according to the theory of republicanism as it occurred in the United States. There were some common features of all these state constitutions. First of all, most of them included a Bill of Rights, which protected liberties from government encroachment on individuals' rights. Most required the annual election of public officers. All created a weak executive and judicial branch, especially by today's standards. Why would they do that? They had a very big fear of a strong central government. They had had their rights squashed, and they really were wanting to make sure that didn't happen again. All of the states had legislatures, which were given sweeping powers as the democratic branch of their state governments. People elected representatives. That's the representative form of government, or republican government. Poorer Western states tended to be disenfranchised. They were spread out, and in these new colonial legislatures, they were much better represented. Here you have a typical town in the 1700s, people moving about their daily lives, which relates to the economies of the 1780s. After the war, and as a result of the war, America suffered a depression during the 1780s. There were huge national and state debts left over from that revolution. There was an excessive use of credit to purchase consumer goods after the war, especially debts to British merchants. There was a lack of currency, so you had some inflation happening because there wasn't enough currency in circulation. Farmers demanded laws to help with their plight in selling their goods, and at a time they tended to act violently to get what they wanted. You had crazy inflation. Prices were skyrocketing, and that was really detrimental to many citizens who couldn't afford even daily goods. And the British flooded American ports with cut-rate goods and undersold American merchants. So here you can see some maps just showing you some of the makeup and the demographics of the new states. You can see the religions up in these different areas, and you can see the different ethnicities in these areas. And what you're really seeing is a lot of these people were of English origin, particularly they were still very much tied to the English church. The Anglican church was very strong here, and you also had a lot of English and Welsh people spread throughout. So really, you still had a lot of people who were fairly loyal to the British Crown. Except for large parts of Virginia and South Carolina, the population was primarily white, European, and Protestant. And by the 1790s, during the first federal census, less than half of Americans were English in origin, and approximately 20% were African, 15% were Scot-Irish, and 7% were German. The remainder were other ethnic backgrounds. So you were also seeing people turn away and move away from that sense of loyalty to England. Here you can see some economic growth overall in the Americas, but then a big drop in the economy, which was per capita income. And this was a result of that economic depression, dislocations of people during the Revolution, and it really hit people in the South pretty hard. And then it does start to grow again, but it's not until the later 1790s. So one of the things that was happening during the 1780s as a result of all of this economic crisis was the seizure of loyalist holdings and the taking of those loyalist properties. Many estates were confiscated and chopped up into small farms. This helped accelerate economic democracy. That old landowning aristocracy ideal from Europe was not what we had here. It was that pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you owned a piece of land, you too could be part of our democracy. You also had a rich class, upper class, emerging emerging who were making big profits off of what was going on. Not very happy with loyalists. A lot of loyalists ended up escaping to Canada during this time. The economic democracy of the 1780s preceded our actual political democracy. Land was readily available and it was fairly inexpensive. Lots of people wanted lands and they could get it. Now, mind you, who were they pushing out of the way? Native Americans. Manufacturing is important in this time. We're very early in the Industrial Revolution, but manufacturing was bolstered by non-importation agreements. Americans lost markets to the British as a result of a lot of the acts, and now we looked for new commercial outlets to compensate for those lost ones. We were looking in the Baltic region and as well as in Asia to expand our exports and our manufacturing to those areas. As a result, we start to see some foreign policy changes as well during this time. With Britain, they refused to make commercial treaties or repeal their ancient navigation acts, so they were still treating us like unruly children. They remained active on American shores long after they were supposed to leave, and they actually became kind of rebellious in parts of the frontier. We also had to contend with Spain, and Spain controlled the port of New Orleans, and they closed the Mississippi River at its mouth in 1784. This hurt pioneers in Tennessee and Kentucky who used New Orleans as their ports to get their goods to other parts of America as well as other parts in the world. They also claimed a large area of territory of the Gulf of Mexico, which included Florida, the Florida region, and they conspired with Native Americans to keep Georgia and South Carolina hemmed in and blocked in east of the Allegheny Mountains. Together with England, Spain prevented the United States from exercising control over about half of its total territory. You also even had Spain encouraging the creation of an independent state in the southwest out of American land. A young American Army officer from Kentucky actually swore an oath of loyalty to the King of Spain in exchange for trying to get trading concessions for the United States and to encourage this expansion out into the southwest. So here you can see the Spanish territory, Spanish possessions out this way, all the way to the Mississippi River. Here you have the United States, and this was supposed to be all Indian territory. The Spanish also proposed the Gardoqui Treaty of 1786. It was never ratified. It was a separate peace treaty that secured trading rights with Spain while recognizing Spain's supremacy on the Mississippi. Northerners feared that opening the West would draw population away from the United States and influence from the eastern seaboard, and they opposed the southern colonies and western territories who believed that New England was gaining supremacy over the United States and politically dominating. So even though this was turned down by those folks in those southern areas. France, who was our buddy during the war and actually helped us fight even naval battles during the war, started to demand repayment of money loaned to us during the war, and they restricted their trade with us in the West Indies and other ports until we started to comply with that. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, as we're starting to explore new markets, we're having our sort of first foreign policy crisis, which is the crisis with the Barbary pirates off the Mediterranean and African coast. Yankee sailors were being enslaved, held for ransom. You had one pirate who was particularly harsh to American shipping. They were boarding ships and capturing them. And formally, the U.S. enjoyed British protection, but now we weren't getting that protection, and so our Navy was very vulnerable to these pirates, the Barbary pirates. So actually, Thomas Jefferson, while he was president, had an undeclared naval warfare against the Barbary pirates, and it's kind of one of our first examples of a president wielding his war-making powers without consent of Congress, and that comes a little bit later. So The Second Continental Congress was weak during the Revolutionary War. They only controlled military affairs and foreign policy and couldn't do anything with domestic issues. They had no constitutional authority over individual states who were seen as sovereign. In 1781, at a ratifying convention for the Articles of Confederation, the Articles were adopted, but it was not actually ratified until about 1781. It's 8 months after when it was initially brought before the Second Continental Congress in 1777. So the Articles of Confederation was America's first constitution. So it linked the 13 states in a loose confederation of friendship that they would deal with common problems such as foreign affairs. They had a Congress was the primary agency for the government. There was no executive branch, no president, because of the suspicions of tyrannical leadership like King George. There was no judicial branch. That was left up to the individual states. And each state had one vote in that Congress. So that gave a lot of power to smaller states, states that had fewer people within their borders. It required a 2/3 vote to pass a law in that place. That's a supermajority, and that's actually very difficult to attain. And amendments required unanimous consent, which made it very difficult to change a very weak document. So already you can see there's some problems that are going to develop because it was so weak and ineffective. It was intentional. They gave power to the states because they were afraid of a strong centralized government. But there were two very difficult limitations to this. One, there was no power to regulate commerce, and actually conflict was developing between the states. In fact, you could have different currencies between states. There were toll roads, etc. And you would tax each other's goods from state to state, and they couldn't, in fact, force a tax collection system. So the Americas had this big debt, but they couldn't pay it back because they couldn't tax its citizens. And they could not act directly upon individual citizens from a sovereign nation, sovereign state. And this was susceptible to revolutionary challenges, people taking up arms against their government. Meanwhile, you also had some pretty landmark land laws that were passed by that Congress, the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And these policies were meant to essentially create acreage and divide and create acreage and how it should be sold in these Northwest regions. The Land Ordinance created acreage in the Old Northwest, which is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, and that they should be sold to individuals and that those proceeds would then go to pay down the national debt. It created 10 townships that were 6 miles by 6 miles, and that would make them 36 sections, and people could buy a section that was then divided into acres. So that's how we have that system that we now have even out west. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 the regions would become a territory and then would become states. And so it basically talked about how those territories would then later become states. And if you look at this map, you can see they pretty much became states very soon after the nation was created. But it also forbade slavery in the Old Northwest Territory. So this starts to draw those lines between the North and the South in that region. So you can see here are the states as of 1789 to 1790 and all of the territories at that point. And I'm going to stop here and we'll pick it up on the next one with the failures of the Articles of Confederation.